Hello everyone! In the next minutes, Florian and I will present you all of the major features coming to Pixera with the 1.6 update. As there are really lots of changes and brushes coming with 1.6, we will only be able to cover the major big ones. If you want to have a look at all the changes coming, please visit our forums and take a look at the complete changelog. In the Screens tab, only some minor features were added in the 1.6 release. To be specific, there were two major features added. The first one is the so-called log transformation, which you can find here, and you can activate it by clicking this button. And as you can see now, I cannot drag and change the position of my screen compared to this one where log transformation is not ticked. And this should help with locking screens permanently in your workspace. The second feature which has been added on here is this new button, which lets you adjust dimensions of screen to the aspect ratio. So by default, this button is tucked in, similar like you can see here. Now, once I change my resolution, nothing or the size will not follow along. Once I uncheck this box, and when I now start and change my resolution, as you can see, the physical size of my screen will follow along. So basically it will allow you to always be in the correct aspect ratio for the resolution you assign to your screen. Now let's take a look at the so-called feed modes in Pixera. This is a feature that has already been in place for quite a while. However, we added quite a lot of new functions now in 1.6. So what are actually feed modes? You can use feed modes on flat projection as well as on curved projection. So let's rather say 2D projection setups. And it will greatly enhance your experience when warping those setups, and it will also ease a lot because you don't have to set up projector position as precise as you would normally have to do when working with a 3D space. Now you can find the feed modes by scrolling down in the inspector in the warp tab. And as you can see here, now down here you can find the feed areas. In order to showcase the setup, I have prepared a small setup which differs quite a lot in terms of pixel count. So I've got a generic flat screen in place with full HD. And I've got a projector with 4096 by 2160 pixels. So it's not only the pixel amount which differs, but also the aspect ratio of the two components. Now let's start and take a look at our 5 different alignment presets within the feed areas. You can compare them, or at least the first two, quite easily to how content can be scaled into our screens in the compositing tab. So fit will basically try and fit the warp mesh into our outputs, which would look something like this. The second option will now stretch our warp mesh into our output, which again looks something like this. Now with pixel accurate, it's now getting more complex. So now let's start and actually select that. The reason for our small piece of warp mesh now is, if you remember, we have a full HD screen. However, the resolution of our output is 4096 by 2160. So if you want to put the screen natively in the pixel world into your outputs, it would look something like this. The last two options are perspective and none. Perspective comes into place when you have your projector aligned in 3D space, because now it will apply the warp mesh with the perspective correction which you apply in your 3D space. And this differs for the rest of the other feed area alignment methods, because for those fit, stretch as well as pixel accurate, it will always put the warp mesh flat in a 2D manner on your outputs. So this can come in really handy when you got all your pre-visualization going and you just want to play out your flat native warp mesh to your, for example, E2 or any other pixel processing device you have, especially when you want to do the warping in the projectors themselves. The last option you can find in the alignment presets is none. And if you select this option, there won't be any feed modes applied. As you can see now, we are the representation of the projector on the screen looks a lot different. We now got this white texture on here, and compared to, for example, fit, you can now see we got that blue line pointing at the screen, which indicates this projector is assigned to the screen. And none is what you typically want to use, especially for 3D mapping scenarios. And of course, this can also be applied on multi-projector setups. So I've just created a widescreen screen with 6000 by 1080 pixels. And let's just put a projector onto that screen. One thing which has also seen lots of improvements is our alignment feature. I've set it to preview already, and the overlap itself can be put in now with much more detail, and you can also now directly manipulate it. And as I manipulate this value, you can immediately see I've got some additional lines here. So some of the lines are actually the frustrums of the projectors. So for example, here and here. And the other lines, which are actually blue, indicate our texture for the feed setup. As we overshoot now left and right, we aren't able to utilize all of the pixels which we've got, and therefore it doesn't really fit. Now if I start and manipulate this, as you can see, right around 30%, this now looks pretty well and would be more or less a perfect setup without wasting any pixels. So now let's start and manipulate it again a little bit and hit apply. And let's activate the test pattern. Now, if I scroll down to my feed areas, you can again find your alignment settings, fit, stretch, pixel accuracy, and so on, as well as the overlap. Pixera will now automatically take the value you assign within the auto transform and calculate the correct pixel value and put it in here automatically for you. One more thing which has been added in 1.6 is the so-called output orientation. You can now select from front projection, rear projection, seal mounting front, as well as seal mounting rear, and by selecting these different setups, the warp will start and behave correct depending on if you've got the front or rear projection. We are now going to take a look at the changes coming with 1.6 in the warp engine. As you can see, the warp settings themselves change quite a lot. Down here below, you can now find your modifier stack. And if you want to, let's say, add more points, for example, what you want to do is open up the FFD modifier. So this FFD and this vertex modifier, those are the ones being created by default. And in order to add more points, you now want to click plus, and it will always multiply the current value by 2. And the rest is as used or as you're used to. What's new, however, you are now also able to add modifier stacks to your modifier list. You could also say multi-layer warp. And if you want to do so, all you have to do is, for example, click at FFD, and now we get another modifier. By clicking at the pencil edit button, we are now able to activate this grid. So this is the grid for my logo, and just to compare, here we got the one we did just edit. So let's go back here, go to edit, and I will now start and offset it a little bit, scale it, and this allows me now to edit only this certain area without actually influencing the remaining part of my warp engine. This can be really useful. For example, let's say you're doing a building projection and you have windows, for example, you want to warp individually, you will be able to find this feature very useful, I guess. There are also quite a lot of new features waiting in the Softedge tab. As you can see, the tab itself also changed quite a lot. And in order to show you the new features, I did prepare a simple curve screen to projector setup. And as you can see, down here in your Softedge settings, you can now choose from Softedge Warped as well as Softedge Screen Aligned. Screen Aligned Softedge basically is a Softedge which is being put on your output, and it is not going to be warped and distorted by the engine itself. If we now expand the drop-down menu, we can see that also a lot of the settings changed within the Softedge. There is a shape you can choose from, Softedge and mask, different interpolation methods, and the gradient itself in pixels. You can also flip the gradient in here, as you can see, and if you want to, you can immediately pop the Softedge on a certain side of your output. Now let's take a look at the different interpolation methods coming with 1.6. Let me quickly change to mask because it is a little bit easier to show. Now you can choose between linear, quadratic Bezier and cubic Bezier. So for the showcase now, let's go to one of the Bezier ones. And now once I hit my edit mesh button here, as you can see, we're now able to add Bezier curves to our Softedge. Before that, it was only possible to do linear, or to add linear points to your Softedge masks. Now let's add a warped Softedge as well, so we can actually show the difference. In order to add a Softedge warped, all you want to do is click add an element. And as you can see now, this Softedge now is, compared to the mask we did just add, quickly blend it out, warped with the screen. So it follows the warping of the screen. Similar to the warping itself, you can add as many masks or soft edges as you like to, or as you have to. And of course you can also edit all of them individually. And furthermore, it's also possible to lock the element so you don't move it by accident. One of the biggest new additions to Pixera coming with 1.6 is the so-called dynamic screen setup. You can find this option here by selecting a screen or a 3D model in your workspace in the mapping tab. And this basically allows to do tracking inside Pixera. And these options here basically change the behavior as well as allows to apply dynamic softedge, so basically real-time softedge, to your models, which is really important when doing tracking of 3D models through multiple projectors. We won't be able to go through the settings here in detail. Just so you know, stage precision, for example, is already implemented, or let's better say we are implemented in stage precision, and by using stage precision you can already achieve tracking setups in Pixera.
In version 1.6 we also improved the multi-client workflow. So let's start with the presence running on your client. So if we have a look on the presence, which should always be the same version like Pixera on the master, on the top you can find the master IP address. Down there's the RX path for the render engine, and on the bottom you also can find configure network. So in here you can lock your network adapter to a specific IP address, or in other words, you can lock the presence to a specific network adapter to ensure that Pixera always connects to this network address. So let's have a look on Pixera itself. If we go up to the settings of Pixera in Discovery, we also find the main network adapter. So in here you also can lock Pixera to a specific network adapter. So for example, if you have multiple network adapters active, then you can lock Pixera to one specific one. Down there you again can find the IP filter. So if you type in 0, you scan the whole network for the 10th range, and if you click on show discovery, now you can find our client. So in that case it's 10.00.10. So usually you know that if the client pop-ups here, it's automatically active. So if you have a look on the output on the right bottom side, you can see that the presence is still not green. So let's change to live input, and in here we can now find all the clients. So now in 1.6 you have to specifically start the client you want to work with. So in that case, in the inspector you can click either on start, or before you do that you also can use filter your clients on the left bottom corner. If we click on that one, you can choose mode all, used, unused, or individual. So you can exactly define which client should be available for your master. So for example, if you have a multi-client network and multiple masters, you can specifically activate a client for one master. So in that case, we want to activate it. Select our client in our left live tab and click on start. And then you see on your output or on the client that the presence is turning green. On the top of the presence now you see also the master IP address, so that you know to which master this client is connected. If you now assign an output to your display, and if you activate your outputs, then you see your picture on the client. If you now select the client on the left side in the live tab, on the right side in the inspector you can find again the client IP address, master IP address, default storage drive, and also the buttons to close the render engine, to reset it, and so on.
We were now able to add two of the most requested features in the compositing tab. The first one is a rather simple one, but I guess most of you will really like that change. When you now stop a timeline, the screen or the output is going black and all of the content is being unloaded. So there is basically no preload going on the timeline. There are no resources needed for a stop timeline. And this of course applies to all the timelines you're currently using in your setup. The second timeline addition is our timeline faders. You can access the fader, the opacity fader for your timeline right here by clicking on here. And as you can see, I'm now able to fade in and fade out the timeline. Of course, this also works for multiple timelines. I've already added a second timeline, and let's quickly take a look at the fader. As you can see, it follows along in our timeline manager here on the top. And if you select the timeline here, you get one more way to set this up by changing the opacity right here. Now on my second timeline, let's just start and add a video on top of my timeline number 1. And by using this fader, as you can see, I'm now able to fade in the timelines individually. With 1.6 you can now access blend modes on your layers. And in order to get access to them, all you have to do is select a layer and then scroll down here in your inspector, and down below you will be able to find those blend modes. You can expect to find all the different blend modes, which you should also know from software like Photoshop, for example. And they always apply onto the layer down below. So here you can see some of the different presets which we have here in Pixera. So you can see lots of different stuff you can choose from. And you can even go into details and manually manipulate everything if you like to. in the custom tab in order to get the desired effect. Coming with 1.6, you will also be able to benefit from big workflow improvements with in-screen editing in the compositing tab. If you have already been a long-time Pixera user, you may have already noticed that it was only possible to edit one object at a time in the compositing in-screen editing. You would either have to save the changed values or delete the current values, otherwise you weren't able to edit additional objects. So this is something that changed quite drastically now. As you can see, I can edit, resize, reposition multiple objects now at the same time to my needs. There we go, something like this. And as you can see now, within my layers, I've got all the changed values now active. And all I have to do now is, by pressing a button, in this case S on the keyboard, which is the shortcut in order to save keyframes, all of the active values have been saved. Another new functionality now is our gray keyframe, which you can see here. Normally in Pixera, you would find yellow keyframes which indicated changed values, and this was the only way in the past in order to set keyframes. Now with the gray keyframe, you can set keyframes without having to change to get to this active value state. So it will be definitely a lot easier to set keyframes in your project without the need of ever changing values in order to set keyframes for the values you have right in place.
In 1.6, we also have a new feature in the Resources tab of the compositing. It's called Create Color Resource. If you click on that button, a new picture will be created automatically by Pixera. This picture can be used on the timeline in the layer. If you put it on the timeline, and if you again select it in the Resources tab, then you also can change the color of this colored background. So here you have the opportunity to change the resolution, to change the first color, which you see right now, and the second color. You can, for example, define a custom color here with the bar. As well, there is a small library of different colors from where you can choose a color. If you want to create a gradient, then this is possible as well. You just have to enable this Use Gradient checkbox and you will see the gradient immediately. Here you also can change the position of the left and right color. If you want, you also can change the angle of the gradient. So for example, you can create a 45-degree angled gradient. Of course, you can handle this color resource as every other resource. So for example, you can also in-screen edit it on the layer. For example, you can use this color resource as a background for text. So for example, if you want to use a text resource in Pixera, you always need a background. If you want to use a solid color or a specific gradient, then you can create first a color resource and afterwards a text resource like I do here. So for example, I just type in a text, define a line height, choose a font. For example, you also can choose a custom font if you want to have one. And afterwards, you just have to drag and drop the text resource to your layer head. And then you automatically see the text with the set background. If you don't like the color of the background, then you still can change it. So you just have to select the content in the resources, go back to the inspector on the right side and just change the color.
It is now also possible to add masks to content on the layers through an effect. And in order to do so, you want to look for the so-called mask RGB effects. I've prepared a simple setup to layers, to contents, and all you want to do is just drag and drop the effect onto the layer. Now down here you can find the effect itself, and I did prepare a really simple mask which I will now apply onto that layer, or rather onto the effect. So I drag and drop it down here, and I will now activate the mask. And as you can see, of course, I now see through the layer down below, and I've got a masked out content. We were also able to rework a lot of our DMX patching. If you don't know already, you can access the DMX patching by selecting the timeline, and then in the inspector you want to scroll down and open this field which will access the patch timeline option. So now once you click here, as you can see, all the layers you have active in your project will be visible in here. I got my layer 1, 2 and 3, as you can see, with all the different functionalities starting from mute layer, all the positions, size and so on. There is auto patching available, so all I have to do is just select my layer and then hit auto patch. And for certain layers I can also decide between 8 and 16 bit, as you can see. What's also new is the export patch as GDTF for GrandMA, or you can also export it as a simple XML table if you need to. One of the biggest changes coming with 1.6 can be found in screen groups as well as perspectives. We overhauled quite a lot in there, and to start with, let's take a look at the screen groups. In here we changed naming for the perspective modes to 2D and 3D. So we used to call 2D in the current release version content sampling, and the 3D version is the 1.4 called spatial. They basically do the same. With the 3D mode I can access the perspective here in the auto compositing, which I can't in the 2D mode. And there are also some more presets here which you can activate, which could sort perspective placing in the inner compositing. So the dive in itself did change as well. As you can see, we now have a new option here on the left top side of our inspector, where you can choose to which screen you want to dive in. So let's say I want to dive into my screen number 1. I select it, click dive in, and now I jump directly into the inner compositing of my screen number 1. Now here you can find quite big changes. If I now change my selector from layer in compositing to perspectives, as you can see, I've now got pixel values in here for me to work with. I can now basically reposition the perspectives pixel precise as you can see. Or I can also put in the values, something like this, similar to how it works with our output mapping in the mapping tab. One rather more big change is the new option called Screen Origin. There are now two different settings you can choose from. There is home screen and absolute. Please keep in mind this setting is a layer specific setting, so it influences all the content which is being placed on this layer. Now, by selecting home screen, the content will always follow along my home screen. As you can see now, as I change the position of my perspective, the content will of course follow along. Snapping now also is a thing in here, as it was before, but it works a little bit better now. By pressing Shift, you can now snap to all the different perspectives in your inner compositing and shift them around, similar to how you would work with screens in the outer compositing. Now, if I was to change this origin to absolutes, the content will be placed in an absolute state. So it's now detached basically from my perspective. And this can be really useful for situations where you want to, for example, cut out certain bits and pieces of your content and display it on your screen. So let's go back here to layers and compositing, and let me quickly just increase the size of my video here, which is low res. That's why the quality isn't all too good. And now let's go back to perspective, and as you can see now, I can now basically take my perspective, or my perspectives because it's multiple, and position them wherever I need to position them. Of course, there are many more new additions to the software which we unfortunately cannot cover in this video. As already mentioned in the beginning, if you want to take a look at all the changes coming with 1.6, please visit the forums. There you will be able to find the changelog. Thank you very much.